Hello and welcome to my channel. This is my second tutorial on how to paint digital portraits in a painterly style, but this one is meant for a different kind of approach. It will be a two-part tutorial, and in this first part we will focus on three things. First, we will analyze our source photo, then we will place facial features the right way in very easy steps, and lastly we will focus on values. In the second part of this tutorial we will talk about skin tones and light and how light affects color of skin. In my previous tutorial I tried to describe how to sculpt a portrait by blocking in the larger shapes without any line art, looking for values and shapes only, and then refining it by adding more details as I go. In this approach I will begin with an underpainting, so it's very different from the previous one, and maybe you prefer this method over the other. If you're interested or prefer the other method, I will leave a link to the video in the description box. However, both outcomes will be very similar in a painterly kind of style. The only difference lays in the approach in the beginning. Let's talk about layers and brushes for a moment. I usually work with a limited amount of layers. To be precise, I use one layer for the background and another layer or two on top of it for the underpainting in grayscale, and I will later paint on the same layer in color. And it also comes much closer that way to traditional painting. I know that by using modern technology and painting applications you will have the option to use dozens of layers and hundreds of different brushes, but try to stick with one or two brushes only when you work to make the look of the painting more coherent. You want people to look at your painting as a whole and not as 3 or 4 different sections, all individually and differently rendered. Let's say you would use a soft airbrush for the skin and an inking brush to outline facial features and then a heavily textured brush for the hair. That certainly would look weird. For this painting I used 2 different brushes. The first one is called Salamanca and I used it in its default setting. You can find it in the painting section of your brush library. The Salamanca brush is very transparent and has a nice painterly texture. I want the brushwork to be visible at the end. It gives your work character and it's so much more interesting to look at, in my opinion. But you can use any other brush if you want. I only recommend it has some texture to it. The second brush I used is the turpentine brush, but I only used it at the very end to play around a bit. For the actual portrait it wasn't that important. And I have to add something else before we begin. I don't use the blending or smudging tool. The reason is simple. Firstly, it will destroy the beautiful texture of your brush, and once you use the smudging tool, you will very quickly overdo it and use it way too often. And suddenly everything looks blurry and waxy. Secondly, it's very tempting to mix colors right on your painting instead picking them from your color wheel. But very often we also need to change the value, not only the hue. And that is something the smudging tool can't do. Lastly, there is this misconception that shadows and the transition from shadows to light are always soft and smooth, and that is simply not true. If you are not going photorealistic or hyperrealistic, you shouldn't worry too much about the texture or surface of objects as well. As long as the values are right, your brain will do the rest. So I recommend to work with limited tools. You will also learn solving problems with your brushwork. Let's begin with the tutorial and I will guide you through every single step from start to finish. The subject I chose for this demo is Arya Stark as one of the Faceless Men. The reference I have found on a YouTube channel called TV100K. The guys who run that channel have done the photo manipulation themselves, I believe. So if you are curious what's behind this story, Go and check it out. I will leave a link to the video in the description as well. Maybe the following situation is familiar to you. You want to paint something and you don't really know what you should paint, so you're browsing the web looking for inspiration and reference, and then suddenly you see this picture where you think, that's it, that's the one I want to paint or draw. But very often we don't think about following things. What's the composition? What's the lighting? What about the values? Is the resolution okay? Or what's the size of the picture? And then you begin and you are halfway through the painting. You have spent hours working on it, and then you reach the point where you think, I don't know how to continue. To avoid that, you should choose your reference carefully. Before you start producing a portrait, I recommend you have a closer look at the source photo, screenshot or model or whatever you are painting from. Take a few minutes and just look at it. You will notice details you would not have noticed if you had started painting right away. Let's analyze this photo since there's a lot to discover. What we first notice is that it's an outdoor scene. And we can also see that it's obviously a sunny day. This gives us valuable information about the light source in this scene. Sunlight has a warm tone, so most of our skin tones, with a few exceptions, will be warm. But I will go more into detail about color in the second part of this tutorial. For now, it should be enough for us to know that it's outdoors. Have a look at her face and analyze the facial expression for a moment. You can see how she squints her eyes because she's looking towards the sun. It means her eyebrows are drawn together to protect her eyes from above, and her lower eyelids will draw upwards to protect her eyes from the bright sunlight as well. Don't make the mistake to lower her upper eyelids instead when you paint. This will give her some sort of relaxed or sleepy facial expression. And it would be the absolute opposite of what we want. Since she draws her eyebrows together and squints her eyes, it also has a small effect on her mouth. You can run a short experiment by yourself to see this effect. Look inside a mirror and narrow your eyes by drawing your lower eyelids upwards, like if you're looking into the sun. Do you notice what happens to your mouth and your cheeks? Yeah, I know it's very subtle, but we need to acknowledge these changes in her facial expression in order to get the likeness properly done. If we neglect all those details, later those details will sum up and you might be surprised why your painting doesn't look anything like the source or your reference. So let's take special care of those details. Now that we know about the scenery, the light and which effect it has on her face, let's start with the underpainting. So I started the painting by staining the canvas because I don't want to paint on a bright white surface. The reason why you should put in a background first is that it is easier to find your values later in the actual painting. If the background is very bright or white, we tend to paint the values not dark enough, and vice versa. That's called simultaneous contrast. And it's about the relations of values and colors have to each other when being placed very close next to each other. So the background value is very important for us in order to see the values in the portrait the right way. As you can see, the background in the reference is gray and has a muted yellowish kind of hue where the sun hits the wall and a cooler bluish kind of tone in the shadow area. Since I'm doing a sketch first, I won't bother too much with the background for now. I only want to get rid of the white, but I definitely come back to the background later. On my second layer, which I place on top of the background layer, I begin with the rough shape of the head. There are many different approaches, such as the Loomis method. I have found out for myself that indicating the center line and dividing the head horizontally into half is enough for me. But how you draw the head is of course up to you, and you can choose any other method you prefer. If you divide the head horizontally into half, that's pretty much where the eyes are. I indicate the eye sockets, and don't be afraid or ashamed to use measuring tools to get the placement right. There is no rule that says you can't do that. I even hold a transparent ruler against my laptop screen to measure distances. My advice, though, is to set your reference in the same size as you like to paint it to make it easier. My tip here: measure the distance across the head at the same level as the eyes, and then measure the distance between the edge of her head and the eyes. One common mistake people make is drawing the eyes too large. To avoid that, you can use your pencil or ruler and really measure the exact distance and length of the eyes. After I put in the eye sockets, I draw the bridge of the nose, and this is a crucial part of the painting. In order to get the likeness right, you have to be very precise with the placement of the eyes and the nose. I indicate the mouth, and as you can see, the edges of the corner of the mouth and the tip of the nose almost line up. Use your stylus, your Apple Pencil or ruler, and hold it against your screen or photograph to see where points relate with each other. Do that as often as possible, in fact. It will help you a lot. To get the distance between nose and upper lip right, you can use the philtrum as a landmark. But the rule of thumb is the head can be divided into thirds, from the hairline to the socket of the eyes, from the sockets of the eyes to the bottom of the nose, and from the bottom of the nose to the chin. I indicate the eyebrows as well, and as you can see, I'm not focusing on details so far. Often it helps if you indicate the hairline or the hair, and in this case Arya is wearing a hood. So I indicate roughly where it goes to get a better understanding of the composition. Now I draw the eyes, which proportions and distance to each other I have measured before. The distance between temple and corner of the eye is very important in order to place the eye correctly in space. I correct the placement of the nostrils on the left side. As you can see, the edge of the nostril does not line up with the corner of the eye. I focus a bit on the mouth because it's a very important part of her expression, and the slightest deviation can change a facial expression completely. Put the corners of the mouth just a millimeter up on both sides, and it will appear like she's smiling. Put them just a millimeter too far down, it will give her face an angry expression. Put the lower lip too far up and she will pout. You might be wondering why I put the hair into my painting in such an early stage, but actually I'm not interested in the hair at all. What I want to see is the angle of her forehead and cheek on the right side and the curve of her cheek and jawline on the other side. And to see it easier, I put in these dark values. The darkest values within her face is the space between her eyes and the upper eyelids. I'm checking the angle on her right cheek with a fresh eye from time to time, because there's always an issue. I always have problems with that. If you have the chance, don't linger too long on one part of the painting. It causes your brain literally to unsee mistakes. There is no rule that says you can't jump around on your canvas and work on multiple areas at the same time. That's what I do often. Another dark value I can see between her lips, in her upper lip, the nostrils, and the shadow underneath her lower lip. It is not as dark as her eye sockets, but I decided that it would be a good decision to put these darker values in as well. The eyebrows we will leave alone for now, but we will come back to them later. At this stage, I jump around on my canvas and put in halftones where I see them. There is no rule how I do it. My advice is to put them in where you see them. If you can't get the value or the darker halftones correct the first time, don't worry. Put them in and build up the values step by step. To make it easier for you to see those values, you can convert your reference photo into grayscale. Here I flip the canvas. The reason why I'm doing this is to see the painting with fresh eyes, and you will detect mistakes much easier. If you use Procreate, I can recommend the Liquify tool in order to move parts in your picture around like I just did with the tip of the nose. And here you can see the advantage of painting everything on one layer. If I had painted the line art, the halftones and the shadows on 3 different layers, it would have been much more complicated to move these things around quickly. I also try to find the brightest parts in the picture as well, which are the highlights. You can find them on the tip of her nose, the bridge of the nose, the upper cheek, and maybe above and underneath the eyebrows. But they are not as bright as the other highlights. I would almost say these are brighter halftones instead. Some more brighter halftones we find on her chin and forehead. Be careful though, even the highlights are usually not pure white. You will always find the local color and the color of the light source in it. If I'm really not sure or I'm afraid to mess up an area in the painting, I add a third layer on top of it, on which I try things. I did so with the nostrils, for example. It's also a nice way to compare before and after. A few more adjustments, looking for brighter and darker halftones. And at this point I thought the underpainting would be good enough to begin blocking in with color. You can do that on a separate layer, or you can do it on the very layer you have painted your underpainting. In this case, I used another layer in the beginning, but later I decided to paint on the same layer as my underpainting. That's it for the first part. Next time we will continue with the actual painting, using the underpainting as a guide in order to see shapes and values better. If you have questions, feel free to ask me in the comment section. I hope this first part was somehow helpful. I thank you very much for watching and see you very soon in the second part.
And for heaven's sake, don't paint pretty.